Jay, why don't you talk about the work you've been doing, that's both pioneering in its innovation, but also a return to our roots as physicians and healers, and to talk about what that really means to you.
Yeah, sure. It's a pretty big day for me, actually. 4 years ago, I started a pretty interesting practice in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. Basically what you do, you would go to my website. It was a well-designed website. You would see what I was all about, and you would say, make an appointment if you liked me. That would enable you to see my Google Calendar, and you can input your address and your symptoms. That would send an alert to my iPhone. I'd do a house call. You'd pay me via PayPal, and then we'd follow up via email, IM, or video chat. It was kind of amazing because I was coming off of my second residency at Hopkins. I was in preventive medicine. And, healthcare obviously to me was pretty broken, as we all sort of know. And I was able to save up $1,500. And that $1,500 enabled me to open up this practice. Now, my practice had about 10% overhead versus 70% overhead for a regular doctor's office. It got me 7 million hits on my website in the first month. It was pretty amazing because, that said to me, there's an interesting demand in our culture for a new way to go to the doctor. If 70% of office visits can be, are not even necessary with good communication, a good relationship, what does it mean to go to the doctor? And these are the kind of issues that I've been working on. Now, it's pretty fascinating, though, because about 6 months after I started my practice, I got this letter in the mail from the state that said, we're placing you under investigation. You're using the internet to talk with your patients. I spent $8,000 on legal defenses, 2 days off work, went in and chatted with them, with the lawyer. They looked at all of my records and said, oh, sorry, we apologize for the inconvenience. And then it was like these two old retired doctors that whipped out their iPhones and they proceeded to show me how their kids are texting them and how cool this practice is, and I was very excited about it. But it really frustrated me because, I'm a doctor, I'm a little bit of a weirdo, I'm a little different than most doctors. And I stepped out of residency and into this entire ecosystem that is not so much uncreative, but anti-creative. And I'm a creative guy. And I just think that, we think differently.
Yeah.
And why aren't we the norm?
So, Chris, you talked
Chip, you can call me Chip. That's okay, no
I'm
problem.
sorry. Chip, excuse me. You talked earlier about the core values that you built your company around. And they are different than what most people would say are the right core values for a business, and yet you've been wildly successful because of that. Could you address that?
Well, I think first off, I reached that bridge in life where I decided it was more important to me to live the kind of a lifestyle that I wanted. So I took this course. It was a landmark advanced course, and it really came down to giving without expectation of return. So I decided I was going to set up a company around that type of thing. And so the three bases of it were, it really came down to figuring out that in the healthcare system, to step back, in the 30s, people thought it was 30% of all illness came from stress. In the 50s, 50%, 70s, 70%. So I just kind of came up with 99% of all illnesses come from stress. And I started to look into the three things I kind of set out as the basis for stress, and one is people have a lack of integrity. So meaning that people are telling white lies, they're telling lies, they're showing up late to meetings, anything where they're saying what they say they stand for and aren't really being. The second one would be being self-responsible for life. So in other words, if I was walking across the street and the light said walk, and I got hit by a car and became a paraplegic, I could spend the rest of my life blaming that person who hit me, or I could be responsible and say, I was out there, I'm taking responsibility for me being out in the world, and now I'm a paraplegic. What am I going to do about it? This kind of goes back to Corey and Rob's conversations. The third one I find is people have lack of choice, or they don't understand they have choice, and choice all comes from living in the moment. So in other words, if I have a bad experience in the past, let's say again I wear a purple shirt to a party when I'm 13, and in my future I will never buy another purple shirt. So my future is only given to me from my past. So my ability then to eliminate my past then gives me no future, which leaves me in the present empty and meaningless, which gives me the ability to create my future unimpeded by my past, which gives me a way of operating in my present.
And so in a way, what you're talking about is really the goal of most spiritual teachings, which is whether you're using meditation or yoga or anything, to really be in the present moment. And that how empowering that can be, because ultimately people only have power over you if they have something that you need. And you said that one of your core values when we talked last night was that to give without expecting anything. And that's not the way that most people do business, but yet it's caused you to become very successful. And I think in part because of the core values that you impute to the people when you train them, and the powerful community that creates, which itself is a healing experience as well as being a profitable one. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, at LuLuLemon we call it the law of attraction. So whoever I am is who I will attract into my life. So if I want to, and I think this is the same with criminals and people that are sick. Even people that are sick will attract people that are sick into their lives. So on the very opposite end of that then is if I want to be great, if I want to be healthy, if I want to live a long life, if I want to have fun, if I want to have a great sex life, I have to be all those things before those other people will come into my life in order to confirm and sustain where I want to be.
Like Gandhi, be the change you want to see in the world.
Yeah, it's perfect.
And you also ended up creating a community, although in a different way than most doctors do. And how have you found that to impact your work?
Well, it's interesting that, most doctors nowadays don't work in the neighborhood. And to me, it was so fulfilling to just walk down the streets of Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and just have somebody say, "Hey, doc." I mean, it just doesn't happen anymore. Whenever you treat friends of friends, you see how, one friend's behavior influences another friend's behavior. Whenever you go into one person's home and see their refrigerator, you can see how they eat. Whenever you go into their friend's, home and see their refrigerator, you can see, why they're friends. That's really important from a doctor's perspective because health is so social. It's funny. I've lived in my same apartment for 4 years, and I lived there for 3 years and didn't know my stove was broken. But I started dating this woman who loved to cook, and she's like, "Let's cook dinner tonight." I said, "Great, that sounds great." So I tried to turn it on and didn't turn on. A few minutes later, I had to figure out that it would you plug it in. But the point is, I was stuck in this circle of eating out, not knowing what I was eating, and it took a new social change in my life to influence my life for the better.
Well, that's something that I'm so interested in, especially when you look at the studies that I mentioned earlier, that people who are lonely and depressed are up to 10 times more likely to get sick and die prematurely. I don't know anything in medicine that has that kind of impact. And yet, we don't really embody that in our lives so often. The doctor, go take this job in Omaha, you're going to have to move and drag your kids with you and, not see your friends and make new friends. But we don't really factor the real cost of that into the equation. But you've talked about how important those social factors are in your business, and you've talked about it in terms of healing. To me, part of the value of science is it can raise the awareness and then realize that we are making choices and they have consequences beyond what we had originally thought. And I'm curious to know what your perspectives are on that.
Well,
That the time we spend with our friends and family is not just a luxury that we do after we've done all the important stuff, that maybe it is the important stuff.
I mean, I think all I can do is agree with you. You know, and it's funny, like I feel like I have a utopic life because of everything that you've said up here and everything you've said, Dr. Cornish. And so it's almost...
It's Ornish, not Cornish, just like it's not Chip. It's sorry. It's Chris. You get a little nervous, you forget.
Touché. It's almost hard for me because I'm too far in the forest to see. For me, it's all worked. And so I'm a born-again, you know, Jesus freak about what it is that we're talking about. So all I can do is agree with you.
And the last thing I want to talk about in the last few minutes is that, you know, all spiritual traditions talk about diet. You know, in some traditions you can eat this but not that, but sometimes it'll be diametrically opposite. But I wonder what sometimes if just the act of not doing something helps to make it sacred, not in the dry, boring sense, but the sense of really the most special, and that in turn can imbue it with a lot of meaning. And I'm curious to know, Jay, when you work with patients, what have you found that enables them to make these kinds of sustainable changes? And do you ever talk with them at the level of meaning and hope and real core values, and not simply about lowering their cholesterol or their blood pressure, living a few months longer? How do you talk with your patients about that?
Well, I'll start this off with an example. There was a study recently published in Nature that took about 1 million people's cell phones and geolocated them minute by minute for about a month. And the study was in the next...
Was this the CIA or was
yeah,
this...
it was in China, actually. Anyway, and then the study was, we're going to try to guess where this phone is going to be the next month. And what they found, they were right 94% of the time.
Wow.
And so that to me means that, you know, we're just simple creatures of habit. And what people I don't think understand is, like, you know, we're all in a set of routines. We all eat the same food. We all like the same food. We all do the same thing over and over and over and over. And so my sort of role as a physician is to understand routines and to help them understand the positive routines and the negative routines. And that's really difficult if you get 7 minutes with your patient, because you can't be a good doctor with 7 minutes. So to me, it was about forming that community, that in-person relationship, augmented by the way we all communicate nowadays.
Yeah, it turns out most doctors wouldn't recommend medicine as a career for their sons or daughters because it's not fun to practice medicine. If you have to see a new patient every 7 minutes, you don't have time to talk about what's going on in marriage or with the kid on drugs or the things in school or any of that stuff. You basically listen to the heart and lungs, you write a progress note, you're off to the next patient. That's why it was so important to me to try to get Medicare to create a new model that you can spend hours with patients, address the underlying causes, and find that even though you spend more time with the patients, it actually saves a lot of money within the first year. And if it saves money, then it really is sustainable. I want to give you the last word. Chip, do you have any thoughts about?
Well, yeah, I'd like to, two things I think if we want to like really think outside the box. I think we have to look at, like, just as putting an equation to zero and kind of seeing what one end of it would be. What would it be if we took all the money in the Medicare system and moved it all to preventative? Just for fun. You know, would it, you know, I personally think that 90% of people would live 20% longer and 10% of people would live 20% less. But I think it's too tough to move that system. But I think it's entirely effective to do everything that you've said in your presentation, and why not?